contestation since France and Spain primarily were in the midst of fighting battles which comprised the Italian Wars, 1494 to 1559. The Italian Wars began with claims held by both France and Spain to the throne of the Kingdom of Naples, which were then complicated by other political relationships between Spain, the Duchy of Milan, Venice, and the papacy. It is within the context of this long and bloody string of battles that D'Arezzo wrote his first significant political work. Trinacria ad Calorum in 1520 was an appeal to Charles V to stop the battles over Sicily, which was being consistently invaded by various outside entities. After the publication of Trinacria ad Calorum, D'Arezzo left Sicily and was present and instrumental in the peace talks between Spain and France after the Battle of Pavia in 1525. It was in these peace negotiations following this battle where D'Arezzo became acquainted with Mercurino di Gattinara, an Italian humanist who was serving as chancellor to Charles V. Through this friendship cultivated between D'Arezzo and Gattinara, Charles V became aware of D'Arezzo's writing prowess and assigned him to be his court historiographer from 1525 to 1532. In this presentation, I will discuss D'Arezzo's grammar book written during his time in Spain and indicate how he constructs Sicilianità, or Sicilian national identity. I argue that D'Arezzo's conceptualization of Sicilianità was captured through the articulation of language. I also argue that in doing so, D'Arezzo aimed to subvert Tuscan paradigms of language and literature while centering Sicilian paradigms. This shows a national consciousness in D'Arezzo's conceptualization of Sicilianità, since he is not focused on the regionalism of his identity, but rather on the exportation and the outside recognition of his Sicilianness. As mentioned previously, during his time at the Spanish imperial court, D'Arezzo wrote his grammar book entitled Osservanti della lingua siciliana e canzoni in lo proprio idioma. The book was printed, however, in 1543 when D'Arezzo returned to his home in Syracuse. The first chapter is titled A cui quest'opera s'indirizza, to whom this work is addressed or whom this work addresses. As suggested by such a title, D'Arezzo addressed his audience explaining for whom and for which purpose he wrote this grammar book. D'Arezzo opened this section by referencing Dante's De Volgare Eloquentia, in which Dante stated that under the Norman kings, Sicilian became one of the most, quote, laudable languages in Italy. Dante continued, however, to say that because Sicilian culture and language became degraded after the demise of the Norman dynasty, that Sicilian could not be the language of Italy since presently, quote, the most eloquent natives, Sicilians, have preferred not to use their own language. D'Arezzo contested and problematized this assertion made by Dante, as he argued that Dante did not take into account some key factors in the development in Italian and Sicilian language and culture. One argument D'Arezzo made to challenge Dante was that the poetic tradition of Italy could be traced to the Sicilian school of poetry established under Norman King Frederick II in Palermo. While Dante also noted the importance of Sicilian in the evolution of Italian poetry, he stated that Sicilian poetry could no longer be considered Sicilian by the 1300s, since the poetic language of Sicily was no longer the language of the pedestrian Sicilian. D'Arezzo countered Dante's argument as he suggested that while colloquial Sicilian had been corrupted by primarily foreign populations moving through the island, that it did not justify Dante's flippant dismissal of the legacy of Sicilian poets in the evolution of Italian poetry. According to D'Arezzo, it was Sicilians who introduced the sonnet and Occitan verse to the Italian peninsula. The Tuscans, therefore, appropriated, quote, Sicilian poetry, as the genre was still called in the 16th century. D'Arezzo wrote, quote, because the Sicilian language has assumed glory above all others in Italy, there can be no other save Sicilian, which today the Tuscans have appropriated, and that which was used by Dante and those of his generation to write their poetry. Therefore, all poetry that is written by Italians can be called Sicilian. Our rhymes are more refined as we are the inventors of this tongue, the ones which Tuscans claim today to be their own. They write poetry and sonnets, making themselves rich on our poetic genius. D'Arezzo continued his critique of Tuscan appropriation of the Sicilian language by stating, quote, If Tuscans think our language is rustic and crude, they should not take our inventions and claim them as their own. While D'Arezzo took a severe line in arguing that the primary foundation of Tuscan poetry was not Tuscan but Sicilian, as he moved further through the introduction, it was evident that D'Arezzo was not only seeking to critique the, quote, Tuscan forefathers of the Italian language. D'Arezzo's main purpose in this section was to dispense with a Tuscan standard paradigm of language and poetics altogether. D'Arezzo problematized Dante's argument about class as well. In his dedication, D'Arezzo did not dedicate his work to Charles V, whom he was serving when he wrote it. Rather, D'Arezzo addressed his work to two groups of Sicilians. D'Arezzo explained in this section, similar to Dante, that there was a distinction between the language of the, quote, mediocri paesani and the principali siciliani, the mediocre peasants and the elite or principled Sicilians. According to D'Arezzo, the language of the peasants became, quote, rustic and unrefined because of the intrusion of foreigners such as the French, Aragonese, and Castilians. However, the language of the educated elite Sicilians was as, quote, laudable as Dante explained it was in De Volgare Eloquentia. Again, according to D'Arezzo, the, quote, foreigners who bastardized Sicilian were primarily those rulers who came after the Normans. Dante suggested that refined Sicilian had its roots in Greek and Latin. However, because the Sicilian no longer was spoken by the popular classes, Dante argued that it could not be considered the most beautiful language in Italy. D'Arezzo instead, because his concept of Sicilianità was inclusive of all classes, suggested that the mediocre peasants simply needed to be taught what proper Sicilian was. D'Arezzo continued throughout his work to emphasize the class distinction between the peasants and the elite Sicilians. However, while this distinction may have important implications for the standardization of Sicilian dialect, D'Arezzo never suggested that one group was more Sicilian than the other. D'Arezzo's inclusive conceptualization of Sicilianità was made evident when he wrote, quote, "This is my purpose, to record the grammar of our academies, so those who know it can teach it, and those who do not have a linguistic tradition of which they can be content." Aside from clear indicators of Sicilianità, such as the uses of pronouns like our and us, this statement indicated that in his conception of Sicilian national identity, all classes of Sicilians were included, both the popular and the elite. Clearly, as D'Arezzo indicated, the elite were to teach the linguistic tradition of Sicily, while the popular classes were to learn about their culture by learning their language properly. D'Arezzo's purpose, in his words, was that they, all classes of Sicilians, may be, quote, content of their linguistic tradition. D'Arezzo, as many other Italian humanists did, was building a cultural foundation for Sicily by recording the grammar of Sicilian. A sign of D'Arezzo's Sicilianità, and where his motivations lay in removing Tuscan as the standard paradigm of Italian literature, became clearer in how he did not write his work for anyone but Sicilians, not even the King of Spain. D'Arezzo differentiated Sicily from other parts of the Italian peninsula, and he critiqued other parts of Italy for how they viewed Sicily. D'Arezzo, shortly after dedicating his book to Sicilians, continued on to say, "Voglio sia tanto giudicata di Siciliani." I want this judged by Sicilians, not by Tuscans, who D'Arezzo claimed, quote, only seek to judge works believing they possess the knowledge of understanding what is laudable and what is base in poetry, and then they impose those beliefs on all others in Italy. While D'Arezzo opened with a critique of Dante, here again, he was suggesting a complete dismissal of a Tuscan standard in regards to poetic and linguistic traditions. D'Arezzo had no interest in being reviewed or critiqued by Tuscans. This work was a work of nationalism made for Sicilians by Sicilians. D'Arezzo is arguing for Tuscan acknowledgement of Sicilian literary tradition, not for Tuscan approval. In the second section of the introduction, D'Arezzo went further in detail discussing the evolution of Sicilian poetry. As he took to task another Italian humanist, Pietro Bembo, D'Arezzo's discussion became more nationalistic. Pietro Bembo, born 1470 and died 1547, was a Venetian humanist who was famous for his literary theories. Bembo proclaimed that the perfect model of Italian poetry and poems were produced by Petrarch, and held that the perfect model of prose could be seen in the works of Boccaccio. Since Bembo wrote in the style of Petrarch and Boccaccio and sought to propagate this style, he is often credited with establishing the foundation for the Tuscan literary movement which permeated the Renaissance. D'Arezzo critiqued one of Bembo's theoretical arguments that to know Italian poetry, Italian poets must know Provençal. D'Arezzo wrote, quote, "This man, Bembo, is very devoted to the nation of Provence and to the contrary of Sicily. In doing so, he creates contention concerning the invention of these rhymes between the two nazioni, nations. He wishes to conflate and confuse the words spoken by Petrarch, ut fama est, so it appears that we Sicilians have no right to the foundation of this poetry." D'Arezzo is using Petrarch's words from the Trionfi, in where Petrarch explained that the glory of the sonnet came from Sicilians, hence the term Sicilian verse. Bembo instead argued that when Petrarch spoke these words, he was instead referencing the Sicilian court's proclivity for the poetry of Provence. Aside from continuing to advocate for Sicilian acknowledgement in the creation of poetry, here D'Arezzo explicitly used the word nazioni to reference Sicily. D'Arezzo did this knowingly and intentionally, therefore, we can conceive that D'Arezzo was imagining Sicily as a nation. Towards the end of the introduction, D'Arezzo writes, quote, "What is left to answer this question in this contention between Sicily and Provence is solely the opinion of one author who disagrees with all the others. We must ask this question of the rhymes themselves and look to their form to see which patria they would claim." D'Arezzo's use of the word patria here is quite provocative. He is not simply concerned with understanding the poetic form for linguistic purposes. He is concerned with adding to a national tradition. The word patria, homeland or country, in this moment was contextualized by Machiavelli's theories of statehood and the nation in his work, The Prince. Certainly with the popularity of Machiavelli's writing, D'Arezzo would have been aware of the context in which the word was used at this moment. Therefore, the way that D'Arezzo is discussing the poetry as being reflective of a patria rather than the manifestation of a poetic tradition shows that he is using this work of grammar to establish Sicilianità. D'Arezzo continued from the previous statement by asserting, quote, "Certainly when determining the patria of these rhymes, one would say they are Greek or Latin, not barbarian. However, who are we to negate the patria of Epicharmus of Syracuse, of whose great comedies Horatio testified in his epistles, or Plautus, an exemplary heir of Epicharmus, or Stesichorus of Hymera, whose divine future was assured by his poetry, and Theocritus, whose poetry even Virgil failed to eclipse? The opening sentence of this passage suggests that D'Arezzo is viewing the patria of these great poets as something beyond Greek and Latin, something that perhaps others may consider barbarian. It is clear that D'Arezzo is establishing Sicilianità while simultaneously contesting outside perceptions of Sicilian culture as crude, unrefined, and barbaric. While the ancestry may be primarily Greek, as suggested by the names which D'Arezzo mentions, there is a mixed heritage that is not purely Greek and not purely Latin to which D'Arezzo is pointing. This poetic tradition started with the Greeks, was lauded by the Romans, but was ultimately Sicilian. Additionally, while the writers he mentions may be of Greek descent, they were born in Sicily and therefore are products of Sicilian culture and intellectualism. At the end of the introduction, D'Arezzo once again continues with his critique of Bembo as he says, "As it concerns the argument made by that Bembo when it comes to modern Sicilian, I would say that if they are not completely mindless, they do not contain one shred of truth to them. For some like him, our poetic traditions and language may seem disgraceful, but for many ingenious others who truly know poetry, ours is given the highest praise." Finally, D'Arezzo closes his introductory polemics saying, quote, "So it would appear that not only did Sicilians assume the greatest fama of all languages in Italy, but Sicilians in that time spoke the cleanest language in all of Italy." This is D'Arezzo's final indictment attesting to the high culture of Sicilians in comparison to the mainland Italians. Since this work of D'Arezzo's is a grammar book, he could have simply ended with the superiority of the Sicilian language. However, the sophistication of Sicilian people is present in the idea that they spoke the most civilized and lauded language of the Middle Ages, praised by those such as Dante and Petrarch. The argument stretches even further back to how the Romans sought to mimic Sicilian-born Greeks, whom D'Arezzo claims as Sicilian. By ending this way, D'Arezzo firmly roots Sicilian identity within language, which historically before all others in Italy had achieved superiority in poetic, prosaic, and colloquial forms. This is the language that serves as the foundation of Sicilianità and Sicilian national identity. In chapter 6, D'Arezzo opens with the rhetorical question, should vernacular language be used? D'Arezzo comes to the conclusion that because beautiful poetry can be produced in vernacular speech, as can be seen in the examples set forth by Dante and Petrarch, that vernacular languages are acceptable to use in colloquial speech as well as poetry and high literature. D'Arezzo made a significant point in this chapter, that is that, quote, a poet, to produce his best rhymes, must produce them in his mother tongue. This conceptualization of a mother tongue is indicative of the creation of the nation as a fraternal community, utilizing familial rhetoric in order to construct Sicilianità. This is a manifestation of the, quote, horizontal comradeship put forth by Benedict Anderson. That is, in the case of D'Arezzo, the common language which binds the identity. To this statement, D'Arezzo adds, quote, when we look for a poetic verse, we must look beyond solely Tuscan, but look to all other nations which have a standardized vernacular. D'Arezzo is clearly stating that Tuscany is not and should not be a standard of poetic prowess. Rather, each nation should be considered within the context of its own poetic and literary tradition, assuming they have a standardized vernacular. This was a bold statement to make considering the cultural cachet Tuscan held in regards to Italian vernacular, particularly since D'Arezzo's statement suggests that there should be no single standard for all, but rather dissecting poetry within the context of the culture in which it was created. D'Arezzo goes further stating, quote, I deeply regret having listened to the opinions of others and writing my first work in Latin, Trinacria ad Calorum, rather than expressing myself in Sicilian. This was our history, from the most ancient battles to the conquering of Syracuse by the Athenians, and holds the stories of many of our heroes, living and dead. This deep regret of not having written a history of Sicily in Sicilian is an expression of D'Arezzo's Sicilianità. This was a history for his people, much as this grammar book is meant to be the foundation for formulating Sicilian national identity. But he is pained that he was dissuaded from making this work ours. The language then begins to embody the national identity. Since it was written in Latin, it was, quote, theirs. Therefore, for D'Arezzo, the first step in articulating Sicilianità is mastering the Sicilian language. D'Arezzo ends the instructional section of the grammar book by stating, quote, if someone should ever ask me what is the best way to send out our many lyrical verses, I would respond to him as Horatio in Ars Poetica. That is, that one man is nothing without a rich and abundant vein of literature in front of him, which he then builds upon. D'Arezzo's call to action is to build a tradition of language and poetry in Sicilian, which can be exported outside of Sicily and known as Sicilian. This is evident in his use of our verses and how he is rhetorically discussing the emanation of poetry from Sicily to the rest of Europe and perhaps the world. The entire instructional section serves as the foundation of a national identity. D'Arezzo continually worked to demonstrate Sicilian contributions to Italian poetic tradition, advocated for the inversion of the Tuscan paradigm in literature, and boldly advocated on behalf of Sicilians for the recognition of their culture.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
And so we will move on to our next panelist, is Scott Lucas, who is coming to us from the Citadel, and his paper is titled, Who Edited the 1571 Mirror for Magistrates?
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, everyone. And I want to echo Anne's thanks for everyone who accepted my paper and allowed me to speak with you all today. And It was great. It's great to see you. And don't know if this will be as thought-provoking as all the papers that have come so far this afternoon, but it was a question I was very interested in. And I do have a PowerPoint, which I hope to share on the screen in just a second. I know we've all been through quite a few Zoom PowerPoints in our day with the pandemic. So if you can't take yet another one, please feel free to avert your eyes. Anyway, A Mirror for Magistrates was one of the most widely read works of early modern English poetry, appearing in a remarkable 7 editions and 6 reissues over its more than 60 years in print. And these, I gave you a list of the issues and editions here. Despite its popularity in its own time, however, this collection of historical verse tragedies presented in the voices of ghosts from England's past still remains understudied, and the bulk of scholarship devoted to it overwhelmingly focuses on the first 2 editions only of the text, those of 1559 and 1563. Still overlooked in particular are the 2 editions in the middle of the life of the mirror, those of 1571 and 1574. This is not surprising since these 2 texts add no new poems to the collection, but they are certainly not without interest, particularly the edition of 1571, the first mirror prepared for publication by someone other than the original compiler, William Baldwin. The title page of the 1571 edition prominently announces that the collection has been newly corrected and augmented. It's right above the date on this title page, but nowhere in the text is there any indication of just who did that correcting and augmenting. As the title page suggests, the 1571 mirror introduces a number of important changes to the text of the previous edition, that of 1563. And I give a list of them here. First, it revises and adds material to many of the prose passages that link the poems of the mirror. Second, its editor rewrites lines in every poem of the collection and offers particularly extensive revisions to 3 tragedies, namely those in the voices of the ghosts of Sir Robert Tressilian, King Richard II, and Edmund, Duke of Somerset. Third, the editor rearranges several of the tragedies for the sake of chronology. Unlike the first 2 editions of the Mirror, the newly arranged 1571 offering provides no closing prose commentary. It simply ends with the final lines of the poem Shore's Wife, now the last poem in the collection, and the words, "Quoth Thomas Churchyard," before the printer's colophon. Fourth, this edition omits completely 224 lines from John Tolman's poem, Lord Hastings, jumping suddenly from line 500 to line 725 without comment. Fifth, the text adds mention of 2 poems, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and Eleanor Cobham, his wife, to the end of the 1571 table of contents, but does not supply the tragedies. Finally, it offers initials suggesting authorship at the ends of 6 of the 19 poems first printed in the 1559 version, and 6 of the 8 poems added to the 1563 version. In this presentation, I will argue that the editor of the 1571 edition was Mirror author George Ferrers, the only living poet other than Baldwin mentioned by name in the 1559 Mirror for Magistrates. I recognize, however, that not all of the evidence at first look suggests his hand. Changes 1 through 3 on my slide point to Ferrers as the editor. Numbers 5 through 6, by contrast, would seem to point away from him. I will handle all of these today, and I will touch briefly on number 4 as well. Who was George Ferrers? Ferrers was born about the year 1510 to a prominent family in St. Albans, Hertfordshire. By the early 1530s, Ferrers had left St. Albans to pursue a legal education in London, during which time he became a devoted antiquarian and student of English legal history. A client of Thomas Cromwell in the later 1530s, Ferrers occupied various positions at Henry VIII's court in the 1540s, and he embarked in 1542 on a career as a parliamentarian that would last until the 1570s. At court, Ferrers was celebrated for his wit, and under King Edward VI, he served twice as Lord of Misrule during the Christmas season, working with future Mirror authors Sir Thomas Challoner and William Baldwin to create and produce numerous court entertainments. In Queen Mary's reign, Ferrers joined William Baldwin and 6 other men in creating historical verse tragedies for A Memorial of Such Princes, the title page on the left. The work compiled in the year 1554 that would only make its first appearance in 1559 under the title A Mirror for Magistrates, after suffering 5 years of suppression by Queen Mary's government, who forbade its publication. Evidence suggests Ferrers contributed 3 tragedies to the Marian Memorial. Sir Robert Tresilian, Chief Justice during Richard II's reign, Thomas of Woodstock, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, though the last of these did not appear in the 1559 Mirror. More than any other Mirror author, Ferrers shaped his poems in the voices of medieval subjects to evoke in readers' minds chiefly events of their own time, the mid-Tudor period. It is likely that Ferrers's topically elusive poems, in particular Gloucester, with its unflattering evocation of Queen Mary I in its figure of Queen Margaret of Anjou, led above all to the government's suppression of the whole Memorial of Such Princes. After Elizabeth I's accession, Ferrers worked as a lawyer, a landowner, and a member of the 1571 Parliament, and according to John Stowe, as a historian, composing the account of Mary I's reign published in Richard Grafton's enormous historical work, A Chronicle at Large, which came out in 1569. Ferrers died in 1579. Let's turn now to the 1571 Mirror itself for clues. The first thing we should note is that the interests of the anonymous 1571 editor are those of George Ferrers, namely history, poetry, and antiquarian discovery. In particular, the editor shows himself to be intimately familiar with precisely the same unique combination of English historical texts Ferrers himself had drawn on for his own Mirror for Magistrates contributions in the 1550s. The editor often adds or corrects material with reference to Ferrers and all the other Mirror poets to preferred historical sources for their poems, namely Robert Fabian's Chronicle of 1516 and Edward Hall's Chronicle of 1548. Notably, however, the editor also employs John Harding's 15th century metrical chronicle. That work, printed from a medieval manuscript in 1543 and never reprinted thereafter, was used as a source by only one poet of the original 2 Mirror editions, George Ferrers. More telling are the 2 further sources, which together almost no other than George Ferrers might have provided. The first is the Parliament rolls of medieval England. In his tragedy, Lord Mowbray, William Baldwin tells the story of Thomas Mowbray, who died in 1399. He was Duke of Norfolk, who was sent into exile by Richard II. For what little historical information he includes in the early sections of his poem, much of the work is his own invention, Baldwin draws on Robert Fabian's chronicle. He follows this source until his account of the 1397 encounter between Mowbray and Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV, where Fabian declares that Mowbray expressed concerns to Bolingbroke about King Richard's misrule, only to have Bolingbroke repeat his words to the king. The chronicler Edward Hall claims it was Bolingbroke who worried aloud about Richard II's misbehavior, and Mowbray who cravenly reported his words. In the prose link that follows Mowbray in the 1559 and 1563 editions, Baldwin writes that, quote, "This tragical example was of all the company well liked, howbeit a doubt was found therein, and that by means of the diversity of the chronicles. For whereas Master Hall, whom in this story we chiefly followed, maketh Mowbray accuser and Bolingbroke appellant," he means appellee, "Master Fabian reporteth the matter quite contrary, and that by the report of good authors, making Bolingbroke the accuser and Mowbray the appellant," i.e. appellee. Unlike Baldwin, the 1571 editor will not let this conundrum go by. Instead, he alters Baldwin's words after mention of Fabian, so that now the account of Fabian's view of who accused whom reads, quote, "Master Fabian reporteth the matter quite contrary, and by record of the Parliament roll, which is plain that Bolingbroke was appellant and Mowbray defendant. Wherefore, whatsoever shall be here said in the person of Mowbray, who being a most noble prince had too much wrong to be so causeless defamed after his death, imagine that the same to be spoken against his accuser." Only an extremely small group of men had access to the medieval parliament rolls in the years before the 1571 edition of the Mirror, and George Ferrers was one of them. Until the mid-1550s, in fact, no Tudor author was known to have used the medieval records of parliaments, owing in large part to their near inaccessibility. As chancery documents, the parliament rolls, written mostly in medieval law French, were kept jumbled and uncalendared in the Royal Archives in the Tower of London, and access to them was limited to a few crown officers whose duties might lead them occasionally to consult them. Only in February 1554 did new attention come to the Parliament rolls, when Ferrers's friend, fellow antiquarian, and fellow Mirror author Henry, 10th Baron Stafford, became a chamberlain of the Exchequer and began to make the organization, redaction, and close study of the Plantagenet Parliament rolls something of his life's work. In that year, Stafford employed the rolls for his memorial of such prince's tragedy, The Two Rogers, and Ferrers used them for at least two of his memorial Mirror poems, Tressilian and Thomas of Woodstock. Stafford and Ferrers thus could both be candidates for use of the rolls to augment information in a new edition of A Mirror for Magistrates. Stafford, however, had died in 1563, leaving Ferrers alone of anyone previously associated with the Mirror in possession of the knowledge necessary to revise the prose passage in question according to the Parliament rolls. It is just possible, of course, that one of the other officials with access to the rolls, William Bowyer, keeper of the Tower of Records, keeper of the records in the Tower of London, for instance, may have taken on the task of revising the Mirror or passed information from the rolls to another man eager to edit the text. A final piece of evidence from the 1571 edition, however, would seem to point squarely at Ferrers. In the prose passage following the tragedy Jack Cade, the 1571 editor interpolates new information about the First Battle of St. Albans, the 1455 conflict between the Duke of York and King Henry VI's supporters, in which the poem's protagonist, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, lost his life. Most of the new information the editor adds about those who died in the battle he derives from Edward Hall's Chronicle, a source used by nearly every Mirror author. The last two fallen men he mentions, however, are not found in Hall or any other known printed chronicle source. These are Babthorpe, the king's attorney, and his son and heir, which I put in bold in the 1571 prose link. The editor could have found the elder Babthorpe's name and alleged occupation in George Ferrers's own tragedy of the 1563 edition, Somerset, which the editor places after this prose link, and in which Ferrers mentions Babthorpe, the attorney's death. But the 1571 editor could not have found in that poem that Babthorpe's son and heir died in battle as well. It's not mentioned in that poem at all. Where might the 1571 editor have learned that Babthorpe father and son both died at St. Albans? From the same place, I suggest, on which Ferrers had drawn for Babthorpe's name when he was writing the poem Somerset in the 1550s, the epitaph on the joint tomb of the two slain Babthorpes in St. Peter's Church, St. Albans, where they were buried after the First Battle of St. Albans in the War of the Roses. We know that St. Peter was the Ferrers' family parish church, and a young George Ferrers could not help but have seen the Babthorpe tomb every Sunday when he went to services with his parents. Given this editor's apparent status as a St. Albans man, one well-versed in the Mirror author's specific sources, and one familiar with the difficult to read and nearly inaccessible medieval Parliament rolls, it is hard to imagine anyone other than George Ferrers editing the 1571 edition. Turning to the editor's revision of the poems themselves, it is of course noteworthy that two of the three poems the editor revises most extensively are works by none other than George Ferrers, namely Sir Robert Tressilian and Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. The third is King Richard II, a work ascribed to, quote, one of the company in the 1559 and 1563 editions, no name associated with it, but whose author is stated to be Sir Thomas Challoner in the sole surviving leaf of the suppressed 1554 edition. It is in the light of the new editor's extensive revision of Richard II that we must note his change of ascription of authorship in the 1571 prose link preceding it. There, the poem is no longer ascribed to one of the company, as it is earlier, as you see in the highlight on the left, nor is it stated to be Challoner's handiwork. Instead, the editor ascribes this heavily reworked tragedy to Master Ferrers. It would seem odd indeed that the 1571 editor would credit George Ferrers with a work radically reshaped by the editor himself, unless that editor was in fact George Ferrers, who sought to give himself credit for his extensively reworked version of Thomas Challoner's original. Thomas Challoner, we should note, had died in 1565 and had no say in the matter of what Ferrers did with his poem, or the editor of the 1571. That said, two pieces of evidence would seem initially to argue against Ferrers's editorship, and they must at least be provisionally explained. First, there are the initials added to the end of several of the poems in the 1571 edition, initials that often incorrectly ascribe each tragedy they follow to someone who clearly did not write it. Thus, William Baldwin's Mowbray has the initials T.CH. at its end, while Stafford's The Two Rogers is signed C.A. George Ferrers, of course, would know who wrote the original Mirror tragedies, many of which were anonymous. But then again, no editor who had carefully read and revised the text could have misascribed a poem such as Mowbray, which is clearly claimed by Baldwin as his own in the prose link preceding it. Furthermore, the initials added to the tragedies are solely those of men who contributed to the 1563 edition. T.CH. is Thomas Churchyard, and C.A. is Humphrey Cavell. The most likely explanation for how these incorrect initials got at the end of some of the poems is that the printer Thomas Marsh's press corrector, while marking up the text for printing, started to add them to the poems first printed in the 1563 edition, since the names of the authors would otherwise have been lost because of the editor's decision to excise the prose link introducing the new poems of the 1563 edition, in which all the poets were named. So the editor cut out the prose link that named all the poets. So the initials at the end of the poems for the 1563 poems simply identified who they were. Finding himself uncomfortable with all the anonymous poems of the first section of the work, the author began adding initials of 1563 authors to the 1559 poems. As the process was purely cosmetic to begin with, he simply abandoned it with only a couple of exceptions after the fifth poem. Finally, there's the problem of the absent two poems, Ferrers's tragedies in the voice of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and Gloucester's wife, Dame Eleanor Cobham. The abrupt ending of the text, with no concluding prose, unlike the original editions, and the mention in the table of contents of these two missing poems as coming at the end of the volume, both suggest that the printer Thomas Marsh expected to receive the works and their attendant prose links before printing concluded. If Ferrers was the editor, why didn't he supply the tragedies? He was the author of them. The most likely explanation is that they were not yet finished by the time Marsh began printing. The table of contents of the 1559 Mirror shows that Gloucester and Cobham were originally a single tragedy, something also indicated by the prose link found in some copies of the 1578 Mirror, in which Ferrers states that he will present the tragedies of Gloucester and Cobham, quote unquote, joined together. We should note that Ferrers wrote this prose link himself, apparently for the 1571 edition, before he decided to split Gloucester and Cobham, as witnessed by his use of the first person in it when he talks about the poems, as he himself being the author of the poems. At some point after writing that prose link, Ferrers decided to separate the two tragedies into two individual poems, as shown by the table of contents of the 1571 edition, in which they are listed as two separate pieces. As Kathy Schrank has observed, Gloucester, as printed in the 1578 edition, is much longer than Ferrers's other offerings in the 1559 Mirror, suggesting Ferrers expanded it with new material even as he removed the Eleanor Cobham section from it. If this is the case, as evidence suggests, Ferrers set himself the difficult task of crafting two substantially new tragedies at the same time, perhaps even as he was editing others' writing in the 1571 Mirror, or in the brief space between editing the collection and its going to press. The 1559 Mirror table of contents shows that William Baldwin intended the joint Gloucester-Cobham poem to stand in the first Mirror edition in more or less its proper chronological place between the tragedies of Scotland's King James I, who died in 1437, and that of William, Duke of Suffolk, who died in 1450. It's right to place that the Gloucester poem there because Gloucester died in 1447. In the 1571 table of contents, however, the poems are listed last, a strange placement indeed for an editor strongly committed whenever possible to strict chronological order. That he places Gloucester and Cobham, who died in the 1440s and 1450s respectively, after Shore's wife, who died in the 1520s, suggests that he did not have the poems ready by the time Marsh began printing, and thus was forced to break chronology in order to hold on to the hope that he still might include the poems before printing had finished. Ferrers accordingly revised the prose link mentioning Duke Humphrey so that it could precede the tragedy Suffolk in case Gloucester could not be finished in time to put it in its chronological place, and he supplied the poems to Marsh only at some later date. The idea that Ferrers had left the project before the commencement of printing and before finishing Gloucester and Cobham is reinforced by the evidence that the 1571 editor had no hand in reviewing the final copy of the 1571 edition. Not only are the faulty initials and other errors allowed to stand in the work, something any editor who had read carefully the text would not have allowed, but 224 lines are missing from John Dolman's poem, Lord Hastings. The lines were not taken out by an editor. Instead, they were misplaced before printing, and no one in the print shop noticed. The editor made his revision of the mirror contents not by creating a new manuscript, but by marking changes on an unbound printed copy of the 1563 text. We know this because the missing lines of Hastings correspond exactly to the lines printed in a single gathering, the O signature, in the 1563 edition. This gathering, comprising 4 quarto leaves, evidently simply got lost somewhere between its revision by the editor and the printing of the revised text. The editor would have caught this had he been on site at the time of printing to read proofs. That George Ferrers was the editor of the 1571 edition, absent at the time of printing, could explain both why Gloucester and Cobham never arrived, because Ferrers was not there to deliver them to printer Marsh, how the lines were lost in Hastings, because the printer would not have noticed the loss, and other imperfections in the 1571 text as well. All in all, evidence suggests that George Ferrers served as editor of the Mirror edition of 1571. The sources used to revise the work, the revisions made to the text, and even the mention of Ferrers's 2 poems, Gloucester and Cobham, in the table of contents indicate his participation in its creation. While many questions surrounding the 1571 Mirror still remain to be answered, George Ferrers should be seen as the man who played the chief role in bringing the 1571 Mirror into shape. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for 2 very thought-provoking papers. And I'm mindful of time, so we will go ahead and take our 5-minute interlude. My computer says 5:16, so let's reconvene around 5:20 to start at 5:21, and we'll continue on then with our next 2 papers. Thank you both. All right, welcome back everyone, and we will go ahead and get started. And our next panelist is coming to us from Agnes Scott College, Yale Manis, and her paper is Painting as a Venue for Emotional Control in the Italian Renaissance, the Case of Leon Battista Alberti's De Pictura.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you to the organizers for this conference. I was eavesdropping through the YouTube channel in between meetings and really enjoying the thoughtful papers. And I'm really enjoying the fact that for the first time in months, I have a reason to wear real clothes. So thank you for this conference. In my paper today, I argue that Italian humanists valued the art of painting and wrote about it extensively because they believed it can be used as an educational tool, a tool which would educate spectators about socially accepted emotional expression. I will especially focus on De Pictura, a treatise on painting, which was highly influential in the Renaissance, written in the 15th century by the humanist and architect Leon Battista Alberti. From the 14th to the 16th centuries, Italian humanists wrote, read, and dreamt about ideal civic societies. They hoped to become key agents in the construction of these new and improved collectivities, and they believed that the right education is central for accomplishing this goal. Humanists focused their educational efforts on rulers and the governing classes because, well, they were the ones to pay their bills, but also because rulers would be at the nexus of reform and change. Humanists argued to anyone who would listen, which was mostly other humanists, that an education in the Studia Humanitatis would produce ideal rulers, ideal citizens, and ideal societies. They especially emphasized the importance of an education in rhetoric, since language establishes social interactions through verbal communication, as well as affects change by mobilizing individuals and societies into action. This part in the history of Italian Renaissance humanism is well known. What is perhaps less known is that humanists did not focus all their energies on the education of the intellect alone. Rather, humanists perceived emotional education to be of the highest importance as well. As the historian George McClure showed a few decades ago in his Sorrow and Consolation in Italian Humanism, humanists from Petrarch through Salutati and Manetti to Ficino were interested in exploring the emotional psychology of the human condition. Humanists were especially interested in promoting effective ways of consoling individuals who were grieving or suffering from life sorrows. Petrarch, for example, perceived the Stoic philosopher as an animorum medicus, a physician of the soul, and he utilized the full force of rhetoric in his role as consoler. Salutati moved away from the belief in the healing power of language and instead believed that consolation and emotional health are achieved through the social ties of friendship. But whatever their preferred treatment to emotional misery was, language or friendship, all humanists were concerned about excessive and undisciplined expression of emotions. Petrarch, writing to a friend who lost his son, urges emotional restraint. He criticizes his own emotional expression of grief in the past and writes, quote, "I am ashamed of many letters which in a younger age I poured forth piously, but too effeminately, when I was conquered by grief over the deaths of my friends." He especially despises weeping, which is the practice of women and the vulgar, and strongly objects to burial practices which allow the public lamentations of women. According to Petrarch, both public and private weeping are excessive and irrational expressions of sorrow. All humanists, and not merely those who followed Stoicism like Petrarch, were concerned about the immoderate expression of emotions. And by all humanists, I am referring to both genders. The 15th century humanist Laura Cereta, for example, chastised her husband Piero, who, in her view, showed an immoderate expression of grief after the death of his brother. She writes him, quote, "You bear your bereavement over the untimely death of Nikolai with unending tears, as though you yourself had died. Should I believe that you would lose sight of that magnanimity of mind that has enabled you to watch your own family struggling through years of death when it fell victim to the pestilent plague? I myself would like you, and I do beg you now, because it is time to return to your former self. In many of their treatises, humanists argued that virtuous men can control their own emotions and passions. This is certainly the case in De la Vita Civile, a dialogue written in 1429 by the Florentine humanist Matteo Palmieri. In Book 2, one of the characters, Agnolo, educates his younger humanist listeners on how to become a virtuous individual in the civic realm. He identifies moderation as the most crucial civic virtue, and he emphasizes emotional control as an important element of moderation. He writes, "There are 4 emotions which assail the intellect and cause human beings to err. An analysis of them will benefit everyone, especially the young." He goes on to identify these emotions as joy, hope, pain, and fear, and he claims that, quote, "Everyone who wishes to lead a moderate life must resist these emotions so that there is no vice in any of our words and deeds, and we may account for all our actions." Agnolo, the text exemplary humanist educator, clearly takes pains to educate his listeners not only on the importance of language and antiquity, but also on the importance of emotional regulation. Quote, "We have said that there are 4 emotions which make men immoderate, and the first task of self-control lies in resisting them successfully. I am sure that these topics have taught you all you need to practice moderation. Now that you have learned what is honorable, it is up to you to pursue this goal diligently." Indeed, Agnolo urged men to control their emotions with such constancy that even at the unexpected death of their own sons, they would show no excessive emotion. This would require an excessive control of one's emotions in any culture, of course, but especially in a patriarchal culture such as Renaissance Italy, Renaissance Florence, for which becoming a father of male heirs was perceived as the ultimate goal. To summarize so far, Italian humanists were not only interested in intellectual education, they were also interested in emotional education. They did not only acknowledge the communicative powers of language, they also acknowledged the expressive powers of emotion. And just like humanists believe that language, when it is honed by rhetoric, could become a powerful tool for individual and social reform, they also believe that emotions, when they are disciplined and expressed appropriately, can function to create social interactions and the construction of collectivities. In the rest of my talk, I will demonstrate how the role ascribed by humanists to rhetoric regarding language was ascribed to painting regarding emotions. Humanists argued that painting is an art which communicates and elicits emotion, as well as molds and disciplines the emotional response of viewers. In this way, humanists posited that painting, like rhetoric, can create constructive social interaction and mobilize viewers into positive, collective-oriented action. One of the many humanists who acknowledged the powerful emotional effects of painting was Bartolomeo Fazio, a Ligurian humanist who worked at the court of Alfonso the Great in Naples in the middle of the 15th century. He undertook several literary projects for his patron, including De Viris Illustribus, which he wrote in 1456. His list of illustrious men includes humanists, military captains, rulers, and doctors, but it also includes some of the earliest biographies of artists, including those of 4 painters, Gentile da Fabriano, Pisanello, Van Eyck, and Roger van der Weyden. In his introduction to the painters' biographies, he writes, quote, "A great honor was very often rightly given to the art of painting. It is an art that necessitates great talent and skills, and it is not by chance that it requires the greatest ability among material arts. In fact, painting demands not only representing the mouth, face, and all the other physical features, but also much more, like the inner sense and movement, so that the painting looks like it is alive and has feelings, and somehow it is affected with emotions and expresses strong sentiments. In other words, painting is a praiseworthy art form because it represents and communicates emotions." Fazio goes on to write that painting, which does not express strong feelings, is, quote, clearly similar to a beautiful and refined but languid and unemotional poem. In truth, it is not enough for poems to be beautiful, as Horace affirms, but they must be pleasant since they mean to move human feelings and souls in all their parts. Fazio thus claims that a good poem changes those who read it or hear it because it affects emotions. He goes on to write that, similarly to a poem, a painting is not only adorned with a variety of colors, but it is much better if it shows some sort of natural vigor. At least that is what I think. Fazio compares a good painting to a good poem because both will influence the emotional response of their consumers, a poem with language and a painting with images. Fazio goes on to make a connection between a painter's ability to represent emotion and affect the emotions of the viewers and a painter's level of talent and skill. Thus, in his biography of the painter Gentile da Fabriano, he emphasizes how the painter was so skilled that he could affect the emotions of spectators. For example, he writes, quote, "He painted a tempest that overturns trees and all the other things of that kind and of the same shape by the roots, in order to scare and shock viewers." And praising another painter, Pisanello, Fazio writes that he painted a priest distorting his face with his fingers and children laughing at this with such an elegance that they pushed the viewers to hilarity. Fazio was certainly not the only humanist who held that painting is a worthy art precisely because it communicates emotional content to the viewers at the same time that it affects the emotions of those viewers. In 1450, 6 years before Fazio began writing his Viris Illustribus, a book on painting written by an earlier humanist was published in print. I'm referring to Leon Battista Alberti's De Pictura. The Latin manuscript had already been circulating in humanist circles since 1435, and the vernacular version, the Tuscan version, since 1436, and it is certain that Fazio was well acquainted with Alberti's book. Much has been written about Alberti's formal articulation of linear perspective, how he aimed to elevate the intellectual status of painting, and how he conceived the painting in similar terms to rhetoric, since both should delight and educate. But today I'd like to discuss something that has not been discussed enough in the scholarship on De Pictura, which is how this work presents painting as a venue for emotional education and thus as an essential tool for the construction of social relationships. What I am suggesting is that in De Pictura, Alberti argues that a specific genre of painting, historia, can be used for the emotional education of the viewers, and that through this education of emotions, an ideal society can be constructed. Historia is the only pictorial genre that Alberti discusses, and he states that it is not merely an important genre, but is, quote, the great work of the painter. He goes on to state that an admirable historia will give pleasure to all spectators, learned and unlearned alike. In other words, Alberti is claiming that a good historia provides a shared emotional experience, pleasure, to individuals from different social backgrounds. In what ways would viewers of a historia painting derive pleasure? Alberti writes, quote, "A historia will move spectators when the men painted in the picture outwardly demonstrate their own feelings as clearly as possible. Nature provides that we mourn with the mourners, laugh with those who laugh, and grieve with the grief-stricken." In other words, individuals from different social backgrounds would all derive pleasure when viewing a painting which enables them to identify with the emotions of the depicted figures. Thus, a good historia creates empathy and the conditions for emotional identification amongst discrete individuals. Alberti goes on to write that, quote, "I like there to be someone in the historia who tells the spectators what is going on and either beckons them with his hand to look or with ferocious expressions and forbidding glance challenges them not to come near, as if he wished their business to be secret, or points to some danger or remarkable thing in the picture, or by his gestures invites you to laugh or weep with them. Everything the people in the picture do among themselves or perform in relation to the spectators must fit together to represent and explain the historia." By manipulating the viewers to look at specific parts of the painting and by instructing the viewers on what is an emotionally appropriate response to what they view, whether they should laugh or weep, this figure inside the Historia controls the effect and the reception of the painting. The figure directs the gaze of the viewers and instructs them on the appropriate way to view the painting. What are the important segments? To what ought they devote their attention? And finally, how and with whom they should identify emotionally. Thus, this figure disciplines the visual as well as the emotional interaction of the viewers with the painting, while promoting emotional identification between the individuals who view it and the individuals who are depicted in it. Alberti clarifies that a good Historia is not only about what the depicted figures do among themselves, but also about how those figures relate to the actual people who behold the picture. Everything the people in the painting do among themselves or perform in relation to the spectators must fit together. A good execution of an Historia creates interactions between the viewers and the viewed. The Historia unites the individual beholders with the painted figures and molds them into a single collectivity in which all the parts fit in relation to each other and share emotional empathy with each other. This carefully controlled relationship between painting of viewers begins already in Book 1 of De Pictura, which presents the geometrical principles of linear perspective. Alberti advises painters to draw the circumscriptions of objects while using a grid. He praises the grid since by holding it between the eye of the painter and the objects that the painter wishes to represent, the same surfaces will always seem unchanged. Alberti praises the grid as a device that effectively controls human visual perception. The grid disciplines the human sense of sight to perceive in a systemized, mathematical, and fixed manner. Moreover, the principles of linear perspective call for a vantage point, which is set by the painter. This vantage point directs the viewer's gaze to the supposed ideal way in which the depicted world of the Historia should be seen. By establishing an ideal vantage point and using a grid, by including a commanding figure which prescribes the emotional response to the painting, and by conveying the emotional state of the depicted figures, a good Historia painting constructs not merely a visual, but also an emotional relationship between itself and the individuals who come to view it. In this way, Renaissance painters were assigned a grave social responsibility. Their Historia paintings were to act as venues for controlling the emotional response of viewers, for affecting viewers' empathy, and for constructing emotional relationships. Ultimately, in Alberti's De Pictura, painters are asked to participate in the molding of collectivities by disciplining the potentially varied visual and emotional perspectives of the individuals who view their paintings. Their Historiae become vehicles of social transformations since they teach viewers empathy, they teach viewers what is good, valuable, and desirable, and they enable the discrete individuals inside and outside their Historiae to relate well to one another, thus establishing a whole out of individual parts. Recently, the art historian Helen Hills has argued that we can see Alberti making a similar argument about objects affecting emotions and creating relationships of empathy with individual subjects in his On the Art of Architecture, which he completed a decade and a half after De Pictura. I have argued in this paper that Alberti charges painters not merely with the design and execution of a perfect Historia, but also with constructing collectivities that are composed of perfectly controlled relationships. The art historian Clark Hulsey argued that the principles of painting, which Alberti promotes in De Pictura, were meant to create identifications among the painter, the viewers, and the painting. I have demonstrated, I hope, that Alberti conceives of painting as promoting emotional identifications among viewers and between the viewers and the painted figures. I've also argued that Italian humanists in the Renaissance were concerned about excessive and undisciplined expression of emotions. It is not surprising then that humanists elevated the cultural value of painting if, as I have argued about De Pictura, they perceived painting as able to control and prescribe the emotional responses of viewers. Painting thus educates viewers on what is an appropriate and a socially accepted expression of emotions. It is a tool for an education of emotions, a necessary element for construction of social relationships and the formation of collectivities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will, for our last panelist, move on to Rachel Roberts, who's coming to us from North Greenville University. And her paper is titled "The Beautifulest Creature Living, Cross-Dressing Knights in Mary Roth's Urania and Margaret Tyler's Mirror of Princely Deeds." And just like we may go over, but we will ask you to stick around for a few minutes, right, for some Q&A, so we won't just cut it off.
All right, thank you. I'm going to take a minute to share my screen if I can. And if I do it right, you should be able to see me as well as my slides. We shall see if that is the case. Perhaps. Thank you for your patience. All right, that looks right to me. Hopefully it looks right to you as well. Just a quick disclaimer before I get started. This is essentially the second half of a paper that I read at this conference last year. So if anyone was at the 2019 conference and is feeling a little deja vu, that would be why. I'm continuing on with that argument. Without further ado, Mary Roth bases her prose romance Urania and its manuscript sequel, which I'm going to call Urania 2, on a rich variety of sources. In addition to the Sidney Family Project Arcadia, Roth includes material from Shakespeare's plays, Spenser's Fairy Queen, and Cervantes' Don Quixote. Roth also draws on less famous sources, including Margaret Tyler's Mirror of Princely Deeds and Knighthood. This work is a popular translation of an even more popular Spanish romance. Josephine Roberts identifies Tyler as one of Roth's sources. However, she only takes the time to point out a single connection, which is a shared setting. It's a place called the Monastery of the River in Hungary. I'll expand on that for a second. Tyler features this monastery in the early part of the Mirror. A Hungarian princess named Brianna lives in the monastery with her son Rosiclear, who's one of the knightly protagonists for the Mirror. The monastery is also an emblem for the faith, honor, and chastity that Brianna and Rosiclear display. In Urania 2, Roth uses this setting as the retreat for the widowed Queen of Hungary. In addition, Roth describes the monastery as, quote, "a most sweet and ever-renowned place for pleasure and chastity," end quote. This description suggests that Roth was familiar with Tyler's work and its major themes. Despite this connection between Urania and the Mirror, few scholars have gone on to explore Tyler's influence on other episodes in Roth's romance. In fact, Tyler remains relatively unknown to many of Roth's readers. In this paper, I examine a longer episode in Urania 2, looking for connections that demonstrate Tyler's influence. In this episode, a young prince named Claverindo disguises himself as a lady to defeat a tyrannical enemy. I argue that this episode in Urania 2 is based on one of Rosiclear's adventures from Tyler's Mirror. Establishing Tyler's influence explains a few of Roth's unusual narrative and stylistic choices in the Claverindo episode. Furthermore, examining the differences between Tyler's version and Roth's illuminates the process by which Roth adapted her source material. Connecting these two works solidifies both Tyler's influence on Roth and the larger chain of literary inspiration that created the early modern romance. In what follows, I'm going to briefly summarize both episodes and introduce the most relevant characters. I'll also compare the similar plot style of the two episodes, demonstrating Tyler's influence on Roth. Along the way, I will point out how Roth adapts Tyler's work to fit her themes in Urania 2. Claverindo, the protagonist of Roth's episode, is the banished prince of Thessaly. He's joined a quest, but has been separated from his companions. Wandering in a forest, he meets a young woman, Cleante, who asks his help in freeing a group of prisoners from a cruel giant. Claverindo, quote, "attired in women's apparel," end quote, enters the giant's castle and with the help of other prisoners wins the day. Tyler's similar episode, which again I argue influences Roth's tale of Claverindo, is Rosiclear's first major battle. In the previous chapter, Rosiclear, who's also a prince, stumbles upon a valley ruled by the evil tyrant Argion. Among Argion's most despicable practices is his demand for young women, quote, "for his carnal liking," end quote. Rosiclear disguises himself as one such young woman, to prevent the abduction of his host daughter, Liverba. Razaklir uses his feminine disguise to get Argian alone and to behead the tyrant. The obvious connection between the two episodes is, of course, the cross-dressing princes. In addition to their similar manner of disguise, both princes are described as extraordinarily beautiful while so disguised. Tyler, for instance, remarks of Razaklir that, quote, being thus readily arrayed, he was so beautiful as no gentlewoman thereabouts might parage him for grace or favor, end quote. Roth similarly describes how, quote, there was not so pure a beauty to be seen, nor any that could near compare with her, that is the disguised Claverindo, for curiosity of beauty's own perfection, end quote. Both princes then do not merely choose the same type of disguise, but also experience the same effect, enhanced beauty. Of course, the cross-dressing knight is not unique to these episodes. Sidney's Arcadia, one of Roth's major sources, includes a prominent cross-dressing caper where Pyrocles disguises himself as the Amazon Zelmani as part of his courtship of Philoclea. Roth bases at least one episode earlier in Urania on Sidney's Zelmani plot. The knight Leonius disguises himself as a nymph in order to woo Verolinda. While Sidney's influence throughout both parts of Urania is undeniably strong, both Leonia, the disguised Leonius, and Zelmani have a romantic agenda. Although Razaklir and Claverindo meet and are influenced by female characters in both episodes, the princes focus on rescue, not romance. It seems more likely that Roth draws on Tyler than on Sidney for this particular episode. Since I've mentioned the ladies in question, another parallel between the episodes involves Liverba and Cleante. Both women provide the impetus for the prince's disguise, and both are in similar kinds of danger from the villains of each episode. In Tyler's Mirror, the tyrant Argion has been collecting young women from the surrounding area. Razaklir is staying with Liverba's family when Argion's men arrive to carry her off. Razaklir intervenes when he realizes that Liverba is in immediate danger of sexual violence. Similarly, Cleante reports that her captor, the giant, quote, made a brutish show of love to me, end quote. Once again, Cleante's sexual peril motivates her rescuer. It's also worth noting, however, the differences between these two ladies. Liverba does not speak in Tyler's episode. She is a typical damsel in distress, albeit one with an excellent wardrobe that she lends to Razaklir. Cleante has a bit more agency. She tells her own story to Claverindo, including the detail that since her capture with several others, she's been serving as the giant's surgeon. She uses her position to effect a temporary escape and seek help. She tells Claverindo, quote, I am hither come to gather herbs and bring home a bottle of water that never sprung here, nor herbs that grew, but only mine own invention to get liberty to seek you out, end quote. In other words, Cleante successfully deceives her captor and devises a plan to find a rescuer. Cleante's added agency illustrates a general change between Tyler's earlier romance and Roth's later one. Tyler has been described as the first English feminist for her preface to the Mirror, asserting women's right to read, write, and publish romances. And I have a quote from Tyler's preface up on the screen. However, Tyler's female characters remain largely traditional. For instance, Tyler privileges the role of the Princess Brianna, a faithful wife and concerned mother, over the female knight Clara Diana, who's a prominent character in the Spanish source. Roth, on the other hand, is often acknowledged for her complex portrayal of female characters as subjects, including the poet queen Pamphylia and the sage prophetess Melisea. This is, of course, a mightily simplified reading of both works. However, in general, Cleante's more assertive role than her counterpart Liverba fits with Roth's overall agenda relating to female characters in Urania. Finally, the two episodes I'm considering contain similar methods for the defeat of villains. Both princes prepare for battle, similarly concealing swords under their robes when donning their feminine garb. In addition to providing, shall we say, a Freudian reminder that Razaklir and Claverindo are ladies in outward appearance only, these concealed weapons prove key in both battles. In Tyler's slightly more straightforward version, Razaklir, having gotten into Argion's chamber by virtue of his feminine disguise, draws his hidden weapon and, quote, smote Argion's neck from the shoulders, end quote. In contrast, Roth subverts audience expectations as Claverindo does not actually kill the giant that Cleante has asked him to defeat. When Claverindo enters the castle in his feminine disguise, everyone present declares him the mirror of beauty. That's a quote. The giant is so astonished by Claverindo's loveliness that he forgets all about a prisoner he had been on the point of executing. This prisoner, who turns out to be Claverindo's long-lost friend Licandro, snatches up a weapon and, after delivering a stern lecture to the giant on his idolatry and villainies, slays the giant. Claverindo then is only an indirect cause of the giant's death. However, he proves his knightly prowess shortly afterwards in an act that parallels Rosicler's beheading of Argion. One of the newly freed prisoners, the king of Natolia, discovers that his rescuers are from a rival country and attempts to rally the other prisoners against them. Claverindo, quote, hindered his murderous purpose with a falchion he wore close under his upper robe, cleft his head and tongue asunder, and so concluded his speech and his life together, end quote. Ross subverts readers' expectations in this episode by having Claverindo face not the sexually monstrous giant, but the politically dangerous king. Perhaps this is a way for Licandro, the prisoner, who is the hero of a later episode, to reclaim his agency. In addition, Claverindo's role in killing the treacherous king may suggest that the real monsters are ordinary people with extraordinary power or deep-seated grudges. That is, again, a theme overall in Roth's work, which features many fewer giants and enchantresses than a medieval romance or even than Tyler's Mirror. In general, Roth focuses on the harm done by unfaithful lovers like Amphilanthus, overbearing parents like Ceralius, or tyrannical kings like Natolia. In sum, Roth's episode of Claverindo and the Giant has many parallels with the episode of Rosicler and Argion from Tyler's Mirror of Princely Deeds. Noting these parallels allows for a more sustained connection between Tyler and Roth than has been previously noted. Comparing these episodes also illuminates how Roth adapts her source material. In my brief time remaining, I'll turn to one more feature of this episode that demonstrates Tyler's influence, a lengthy narrative interjection on the nature of beauty. After Claverindo completes his feminine disguise and before he enters the giant's castle, Roth's narrator pauses for the following statement, quote, and ever it is seen that where a man is fair, he excels all women of that like fairness, for as men are in every way most excellent if right, so in the very feminine parts wherein their greatest imperfections lie, yet they will excel. Beauty is but an outward part and unprizable only for itself, fading like lilies, sweet like roses, yet wither, if not with the curiosity of faith and worth the true preservators, it be not lined and furnished from within. But Claverindo hath that too, and thus the beautifulest creature living, end quote. This passage is striking for two reasons. First, the focus on physical beauty and on feminine inferiority is out of tune with much of Roth's other writing. Second, it's unusual for Roth's narrator to interject at such length or with such a moralizing style. The first consideration, beauty and gender, deserves its own paper, which I may inflict upon this conference in the future. I do have some preliminary thoughts that I might share in Q&A if anyone's interested. Roth's moralizing, however, provides further evidence of Tyler's influence in this episode. Throughout both parts of Urania, Roth occasionally employs a narrative voice to comment on plot or characters. Josephine Roberts has suggested that this narrator channels Cervantes' narrator in Don Quixote, often speaking from an ironic point of view. For instance, here's a narrative comment from Urania 1, quote, it being impossible for knights and ladies to travel without adventures, this befell them, end quote. This comment illustrates Roth's usual narrative interjections, brief and ironic. The passage on Claverindo's beauty, in contrast, is substantially longer than most, and while it may be ironic, it is not obviously so. It reads, at least initially, like a didactic passage on the nature of beauty, which is not Roth's usual style. It is, however, exactly the sort of moralizing found everywhere in Tyler's Mirror. As Joyce Borrow and others have noted, the Mirror is filled with didactic passages on subjects including virtue, fate, and religion. Tyler translates many of these passages verbatim from the Spanish original. On several occasions, however, Tyler inserts additional commentary. For instance, upon one of her characters realizing he has been led astray by enchantment, Tyler's narrator remarks, quote, he advised himself the best remedy which I have read of, which is amendment of life, the safest haven for a weather-beaten penitent, end quote. Roth's didactic passage may reflect the particular influence of Tyler on Claverindo's adventure. While Tyler's moralizing passages are often religious in nature, Roth consistently reframes religious discourse around love. In addition to many passages in both her poetry and prose that represent love as martyrdom, in both parts of Urania, love is the highest moral virtue. For instance, one of the chief protagonists, Pamphylia, is framed by the narrator as being the most moral of characters for her steadfast love for Amphilanthus, even though in part 2, she takes a vow not to speak to him and actually marries someone else. Neither circumstance accrues blame to Pamphylia, since she is constant in her heart to Amphilanthus despite his own unfaithfulness. Returning to the passage under consideration, Roth's meditation on beauty's effects may reframe Tyler's moralizing within the world of Urania, where love, not religion, is the highest moral good. It is notable that the eventual bent of Roth's passage is the overall transitory of beauty unaccompanied by, quote, the curiosity of faith and worth, end quote. Roth's ultimate concern here is not Claverendo's outward, beautiful, feminine disguise, but his inward faith, which again in Urania is not religious faith, but constancy or faithfulness. Roth's moralizing in this passage, then, remains thematically connected to the larger concerns of Urania, despite being a departure from Roth's usual style. This departure might be explained as a tribute to her source for this passage, Tyler's Mirror of Princely Deeds. To conclude, briefly, although Tyler's Mirror remains relatively unknown as a source for Urania, a close examination of at least one episode in both works reveals parallels in plot and style. The cross-dressing Prince Claverindo shares many attributes with Tyler's Rosiclear. Differences between the episodes are in line with Roth's usual reframing of source material. In addition, Roth's atypical moralizing about beauty in this episode makes sense when it is read as a tribute to Tyler's frequently didactic statements in the Mirror. Although Roth undoubtedly draws upon other sources in this episode and throughout her work, Tyler's influence here is too strong to ignore. It's my hope that I and others will be able to explore Tyler and Roth's lesser-known sources more fully in the future. Doing so will not only establish Roth's careful use of sources and the importance of works like Tyler's Mirror, but will continue to grant insight into the ways early modern authors collected and adapted their source material. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We are about to hit 6, so obviously if you need to go, then feel free to drop off, but we will keep the panel open for a few minutes to entertain some questions. So those were some really wonderful papers on authoring, writing, editing, painting subjects and citizens into being. Do we have questions? Does anybody have any questions? Heather, I see. And then Jen.
I have multiple questions for multiple people, but I'll start with Scott, if that's okay, since I have known for a long time his deep attachment to the Mirror for magistrates. I'm wondering what you imagine is, and I'm nervous even to say this, Ferrer's motivation for a 1571 revision, for the kinds of revisions he was doing, and in particular, identifying himself as an author, if that's indeed what he's doing. If you had thought that in some cases authorship had been suppressed, not suppressed like censored, but just avoided. So it's a sort of conglomeration of questions, but they sort of circle around what was the moment.
Well, it's interesting, just kind of imagining his psychology, I guess. I think he was upset that there were so many historical errors in the Mirror, that there were lines that he felt should read one way that read another way, that he had sources for the Mirror that were better than the sources that other authors contributed to the Mirror had. And it's one of those cases where you watch your favorite movie and you say, if only I could change that part of it, it'd be so much better. Well, he got the chance in 1571 when all the 1563s, I think, it sold out, and the printer Thomas Marsh was ready for a new edition. He said, wait a minute, give me a copy of the 1563 and I'm going to go through and mark down whatever I feel like doing. He was known to be a very litigious man. He was a lawyer and wanted often his way. So that's what I imagine. And I think he also had invested so much time in that Humphrey Duke Gloucester poem, which was very topically shaped to reflect his reading or understanding of the fall of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who he was just horrified he'd once been the great Protestant hero of Edward VI's reign and Henry VIII's to a certain extent, and then had become vilified as a traitor who was beheaded in 1552. And this was his chance to sort of tell the story and finally get that thing out, but he didn't have time. It didn't come out to 1578.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jim, you had your hand up. Yeah.
Yes. This question is for Yael. The first one is a simple one. Was this notion, what you've been talking about, rooted in Horace's observation that a painting is like a picture?
Yes. So yes, absolutely. So the comparison between painting and language, between painting and rhetoric, derives exactly from the Ars Poetica by Horace.
And then you've said that the painter was charged with creating a commanding figure for creating identification. What did they mean by a commanding figure?
I actually have, if I can share my screen, I can actually show you a couple examples that I prepared so you could see what an historia looked like. Let me just share it. Okay. And so, okay, so this is one example. This is a historia by Ghirlandaio, The Adoration of the Magi. Here's an example of this figure that Alberti was referring to. In this case, it's John the Baptist. You can see he's the figure that is making a connection with the viewers, with the spectators of the painting, and is pointing to what he thinks is worth looking at in the painting, which is this case, of course, is Mary. But there are so many examples for this commanding figure. And the interesting thing is that in a lot of them, it's actually the painter himself. So this is one such example. This is another historia by Botticelli. And here is the figure that is establishing the eye contact with the spectators, believed to be Botticelli himself. And another example here, this is historia by Perugino. And here is Perugino himself making eye contact. But these are just these are just three examples that I quickly gathered together in case someone wanted to see an example. But really, there's just so many examples of this sort of figure in historia paintings.
Thank you.
Thank you. Much clearer.
Yes, that is fascinating. Chris Crosby.
Just very quickly, another question for you as well. Your presentation made me think back to Heather's about be thinking, because I was thinking a lot during Heather's talk about the role of the passions and emotions, that we're not just cognitive machines, we have these other forces at work. So I was interested in your notion of historia as creating a drive towards empathy, and I was wondering if they also at any point facilitate kind of the capping of those energies or the controlment of those those energies rather. Partly what makes me think of this is the wonderful contrast that your own paper gives from the very beginning, where the wife is just having none of her husband's grief at this point, and is looking for a reining in of maybe what we might call excessive empathy. So I was wondering if it pulls in that direction as well at all.
Absolutely. In fact, this is the point that I was trying to make and apparently didn't make it clear enough. So I'm glad that you brought it up, because I think that the humanists believed that the only way to have proper social interactions and to have ideal societies is when emotions are controlled and disciplined. And they actually perceived painting as to be one of those tools that can discipline emotions. And so what I think that Alberti is trying to express in the Pictura are the various ways in which painting can discipline perception and interaction by the viewers. The linear perspective, of course, disciplines sight, right? The way in which a painting is supposed to be perceived. But what I'm arguing is that in the Pictura, we also see an aspiration, at least, that a painting would also discipline emotions, because it basically gives prescriptions on what is an okay emotion to have, what sort of, who we should identify with emotionally when we view the painting, what is an appropriate expression of emotions when viewing a painting. So absolutely, it caps emotions, as you put it, or disciplined and systematized emotions.
Right. And I guess my question is specifically on the question of empathy and this idea of generating it to a point. Is that something that happens simultaneously, or are these things that are at work at different times, depending on what Historia one is using?
Well, with Alberti, with the Historia, there's no capping on empathy. There is with whom you should empathize. But I would definitely argue that viewing it in the broader context of humanism, and this is definitely how we should read Alberti, definitely there's a capping on empathy or any sort of emotional identification. And so I gave one example, which is Laura Cereta, and another example with Palmieri on Civic Life, where he calls to emotional moderation as something that we need to educate our young. But we see it all over humanist treatises and dialogues, this anxiety about an excessive expression of emotions, which also involves, of course, identification with someone else's grief. So your job as a good friend, for example, is to console someone. But if you're so overtaken by the grief and pain of your friend, you identify with them so deeply, then you're not a good consoler. So yes, my answer to you is yes, we do see that.
Thank you. Kirk, so we probably have time for one more question. Kirk?
I'll make this quick. Scott, I mean, you have my admiration for dealing with that very, very difficult title, and as it goes through all of its revisions over time and all of that. I'm interested in the Marsh Printing House angle, and I guess one would expect I'd be interested in this, because it seems, it's kind of, maybe I'm wrong that it's not a contradiction. I mean, it seems contradictory to me that you have this guy Farrar who's trying to correct things, and then at the end of this, we have all these that Marsh doesn't produce a better version. It has problems. And then I'm wondering about that. And then I'm also wondering, I think I don't know how much we know about Marsh's printing house and his connections. I suspect we do have some people have done some work on this, but my guess is, so the question is there work on Marsh's printing house, and has that helped you in any way kind of formulate what might have been going on in 1570, 1571 in this process? Because I think that's kind of essential to your argument, to have a sense of what Marsh was up to in all this as well. So two parts of this. Is it contradictory? Does it matter? How much does Marsh matter in all this?
You're muted, yeah.
I'm muted. Hope you can hear me now. Marsh is an interesting case. I was able to trace him back, and Peter Blaney's 2-volume Stationers Company and the Printers of London, which is just a blockbuster. I don't know if anyone is ever interested in printing up to Elizabeth's reign. Just get your hand on the book as much as possible. But he was able to show, and I was able also to work out using basically a lot of time at the British Library and Folger Shakespeare Library, that Marsh had contracted with Baldwin's employer, William Baldwin's employer, John Wayland, in the 1550s to print books before Marsh himself became a printer. So that was the connection that the Mirror author, compiler William Baldwin had with Marsh. So when Wayland was kind of thrown out of business and Elizabeth came to the throne, and Marsh was and Baldwin wanted a printer, Marsh became his printer, and so he printed other stuff by Baldwin as well. Marsh, I don't know if anyone knew that the Mirror would be such a huge bestseller, considering it had been written in 1554. It didn't come out until 1559, but people could not get enough of it, especially when Thomas Sackville wrote his famous Induction, which really inspired a lot of poets, including Spenser, to write. So I think Marsh had a bestseller on his hands. He did not have a political project in this kind of sense, and I think he was happy to have Ferrers come and give him a corrected unbound 1563 copy. But I've seen other of Marsh's works, and he does have careless proofreaders, careless press correctors, in a way that William Baldwin, who was a member of the Stationers Company, was not. He was a very expert printer. And I think, there's a lot of mistakes in Marsh's works. It's not just the mirror.
Okay. So why do you think he was rushing? What was the rush? Why, you said that he didn't get what he wanted. So you've got this title page that suggests, what was the rush, do you think?
I don't know if he was rushed, except that there were no more copies available. They'd sold out in the 1563, and people were coming to his bookshop, or booksellers were coming to him and saying, we want more of this. The people are going to buy it. And if you don't publish it, you're not going to make any money off it. So I think he was happy to have a revised version of it. But then when Ferrers couldn't come up with Gloucester and Cobham, I think he just said, we're going to press because there's a market. And indeed, there was such a market that there was a new edition 3 years later. It was that big a hot seller in the 1570s.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you to everyone. And so we can stay on a couple of minutes. I know that certain people have certain obligations, and I just want that they need to go take care of right now. I just want to remind everyone of the social event at 7 p.m., right? And Deneen, I forget, is that a different Zoom login? Yeah.
It is. It's
yeah.
a separate one. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So we will take a break, although it looks like there might be a couple of other questions for, and I'm happy to stick around. And many thanks to Anne and to Scott and to Rachel and Yael for those wonderful thought-provoking papers. Stick around if you can. Otherwise, we will see you back on the other Zoom link. So find your invite, right? At 7 p.m. to celebrate accomplishments. Let's give a thanks to the whole panel. And we'll say bye to whoever needs to leave. But Robin, I noticed that you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
I had if she's still available, I had a question for Rachel. For some years now, I've been obsessed with the notion of what an epic is. And so I also wondered, while listening to Meg's paper earlier and the one on Du Bartas, I especially wondered about these writers on cross-dressing and the women who are writing what seems to me Cavendish and Roth and so on, writing works that really compete with Sidney and Spenser and Shakespeare, doing large works that sometimes involve androgynous figures. And so I just wondered if Rachel feels that, to what degree the writers she's studying are tackling something like epic.
Well, that's a lovely question. I won't claim any particular knowledge of epic and definitions here, but I do think that especially Mary Roth's project, Urania, is very ambitious. And I can't show the book to you because it's holding up my computer right now, but it is on what you might call an epic scale. It is just gigantic. And especially when you consider the sequel, which I was talking about as well. And it's also very intertwined. A character will show up and tell his story, and then in the middle of his story, he meets someone and they tell their story, and then they've met someone who tells their story, and then eventually you're back to the person who started again. Sorry, I'm wandering a little, but I do think that it is an epically ambitious project for sure, and I think overall there is a lot of consideration of what makes a hero, what makes a character important, in the way that I think many epics might ask those same questions.
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you. And Yael, you had your hand raised, I think. So did you have a question?
I had two questions. I mean, I had a question to Anne, but she just
Yeah.
signed off.
Yeah.
But I also have a quick question for Rachel, and that's about the use of the sword, which I find so interesting because a sword is a man's weapon. So apropos cross-dressing, the choice of using a sword I find very interesting. Anyway, just I was wondering if you have thought about it at all.
Yeah, it is a fascinating part of those two episodes. Let's see. What are some things I should say about the sword? I think you're right in that it is sort of a gendered motif, and the fact that both princes keep the swords with them, right, even when they're in their feminine disguises, is really important. That, you know, kind of shows us where their identities are. Roth in particular has a real problem when Cleverando's in disguise. He doesn't have a new name, but he gets called by feminine pronouns a lot when he's disguised. Or I mean, maybe not a lot, but it happens, right, in that episode. And so there's almost a little confusion that, you know, suddenly the appearance of the sword rectifies that conclusion, right, that he in fact is still himself. And I really find that interesting. The episode in Tyler, the earlier source, also has some weird connections to the book of Judith. Judith is disguised, although not in the same way, and then beheads the tyrant and saves her people and so on and so forth. And you know, that's an interesting addition to this like chain where there you have a female protagonist. I'm not sure what to do with that yet, but those are some things to be thinking about.
Just if you want to check it out, the Laura Cereta, the humanist that I mentioned, she has a treatise on marriage, and she tells the story of the Roman Lucretia, and she changes the story, the original story. In Livy, of course, Lucretia uses a dagger or a knife to kill herself, but Laura Cereta turns it into a sword. And so that's what caused me to think about that. Anyway, something to check.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you so much.
No, that's the great suggestions. And Jim, I see that you had posted a question for Anne, and unfortunately she had to leave, but I can copy and paste that and save it, and then, you know, let her know tomorrow that she had a question. So let's do.
She said she'd be here tomorrow.
Okay, good. Let's go ahead and wrap up for now. And thanks everyone so much for the wonderful papers and for sticking with us. And we'll hope to see everyone at 7, and then otherwise tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. the panels will reconvene. So thanks very much. It's been a great first afternoon. See you later.
So Helen, how long is the event tonight?
It's slated to last for an hour from 7 to 8, and it's kind of like there's a little bit of a program, and then I'm sure if people wanted to chit chat past that they could, but 7 to 8.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, we've got dogs and stuff, so we've got to do a couple of things.
Yeah. No, I think if you can drop in, great, and drop out when you need to. We have maybe 5 or 6 people who have sort of recent scholarly accomplishments that they're going to speak to, and then there's a little bit of gap time for people who didn't maybe communicate with DENEEN and wanted to speak up or just talk a little bit. So, but yeah, technically 7 to 8.
Okay.
So, okay. Thanks so much for being here. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Okay.
Bye-bye.